Good evening, everyone. My name is Keith Williams, and on behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to Nature Hour. Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. For 50 years, our organization has sought out natural places that are so special, they must be protected. Our stewardship team works to restore and maintain these special places, which are then open for us to enjoy 365 days a year. Places like Shanks Ferry, Kelly's Run, Otter Creek, Climbers Run, Hellam Hills, Welsh Mountain, and many others are protected forever. We launched Nature Hour with the goal of bringing an assortment of local and regional experts directly to your home with presentations that help us all better understand the Conservancy's work and the work of our community partners. The format for tonight's lecture is a 40-minute presentation followed by about 20 minutes of questions and answers. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll do our best to have them answered at the end of the presentation. This is the third lecture of our 2022 winter-spring season. Our next Nature Hour will be March 23rd. Sarah Dykman rode her bike 10,000 miles following the monarch migration round trip from Mexico to Canada and back again. She'll share her adventure with us March 23rd in our Nature Hour, Biking with Butterflies. We also have a number of in-person events planned for the spring, including a spring equinox hike in partnership with Interfaith Partnership for the Chesapeake, multiple nature preserve interpretive hikes, and a number of opportunities to give back to nature through volunteer events. Our annual meeting will be on April 21st. You can learn more and register for all of these events on our website, lancasterconservancy.org, under upcoming events. The Conservancy is blessed with incredible corporate support, and tonight we want to recognize our annual sponsors, who include Clark Associates, Electron Energy, Ritu, Stauffer's of Kissel Hill, Penn Stone, Nimblist, and Dart Container. The generosity of our sponsors make Nature Hour and the Conservancy's work possible. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's Nature Hour, Trees, Farming, Regeneration, and Climate with Dale Hendricks. At times, it feels like we're constantly faced with huge, insurmountable global problems, but tonight we're going to explore some solutions. Dale Hendricks is with us tonight to explore how an old way and newly reappreciated approach to agriculture can be a huge help with many of the intertwined environmental health and weather crises that we face as a planet. We'll take a deep look at diverse and regenerative farmscapes and the many tree-based crops we can grow for healthier farms, waters, and farmers. Dale Hendricks has been growing and propagating plants professionally since 1975, first with Greenleaf Enterprises in Lancaster County. In 1988, he co-founded North Creek Nurseries in order to propagate and grow perennials and grasses with an emphasis on natives. He's been honored with the American Horticultural Society's Individual Commercial Award and the Perennial Plant Association's Young Professional Award, along with the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society Award of Merit. He's taught plant propagation at Longwood Gardens and lectures widely. He served on the founding board of the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia and served as the co-chair from 2004 to 2007. In 2009, he founded Green Light Plants to build carbon-friendly and regenerative landscapes, growing native, woodland, and permaculture plants organically and joyfully. He lives in Landenberg, which is in southern Chester County, Pennsylvania, with his family, where he gardens, propagates plants, and grows good soil. Please join me in welcoming Dale Hendricks.
Thanks, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm going to presume you can hear me, and it's a great honor to be here. And boy, where to start? There's so much here. First, I'm going to say I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 major topics, and they could all be an individual talk. So I implore you to please ask questions in the chat, because we're going to cover a huge amount of territory. So let's just start in here. Sometimes I call the talk the rest of the story, right? So there's just a lot to all the issues we're looking at, particularly climate and carbon and soil, and we're gonna look way wider and deeper and hopefully have some real good take homes. Okay, so there we have the talk. So these are good books. Next slide is just a brief picture of the handout. So I have a really good, like 3 or 4 page handout with a lot of hyperlinks that you all get. If you've signed up for this, you'll get it in an email. And there's just a lot of good things written about the topics I'm covering here. We'll talk a lot about a guy who has written in the tree crops book. We'll cover a little bit about biochar or charcoal, a form of carbon. We'll talk about grazing and cows. And the last one there, the climate, the news story, we'll talk about a way bigger picture. And it's going to be fun. So again, here's brief look at the handout. So I have a lot of interesting things, and that first link at Amazing Carbon is interesting. So going to introduce you to a term you might not have heard of before tonight. It's called the liquid carbon pathway. So remember that, and we'll get back to it. It's invisible good things that plants do. So let's just dig in here. So here's what I'm hoping to send everybody home with. Okay, here's what I hope people can learn from this, that the climate situation has a lot to do with energy, of course, and fossil fuels we burn, but it maybe is not the whole story. So that's kind of what I'm saying, that how we have land management and trees and plants, or when we don't, that they matter a whole lot in the weather and climate picture too. And so the idea is that, I think the way my buddies put it is the hippies were right. The world turns out to be alive. Soils turn out to be breathing in and out carbon, just like they're alive. And the world is also sweating and breathing and cooling from clouds and whatnot. So we'll get into the different forms of carbon. And it might seem complicated, but I want people to just realize that we can do this. It isn't all the details that I'm going to present. It's more like looking at things in systems. If you change your frame into thinking these things work in complex systems, and I can get that, we don't have to be technicians that remember all the details, okay? So again, this is a philosophy major dropout that's talking to you here. So also that all these habitats are impacted by climate change, but what's cool is that habitats also create conditions conducive to their well-being. In other words, everything gardens, right? So water wants to cleanse itself and get better. Habitats want to get more diverse and more stable and more beautiful. So everything's alive. Give me a second here. So this is also just saying what I've kind of got to before, that only looking at carbon, framing this as a question only of physics and chemistry, misses an opportunity for us to see beauty, connectedness, and the many opportunities for engagement. So we'll see that ecosystem restoration is climate stabilization, and it's not just carbon. And finally, we'll get into the fact that water vapor is a major and underappreciated greenhouse gas that both holds heat and has cooling properties. And everybody kind of knows this. Again, it's not technical, it's common sense. So isn't this nice? So this is our work, right? We have to get in the habit as a culture of taking care of the place. And here we go. So we'll start with, we're going to look at the carbon cycle from a bigger point of view. Then we're going to take a bigger, wider view of the Earth systems. We might call it the heating and cooling of the climate. Then we're going to look at some solutions, particularly tree-based agriculture solutions. So here on the Earth, on the land, most of the carbon is in the soils. So a lot of carbon has been lost in the soils. So if we can put it back, it can be a huge major factor, and we can put it back and solve many other problems at once, as we'll see. Okay, so the most of the soil action is in the ground. So this is crazy. Everybody knows this line is going up. This is CO2. It's been going up very steadily, but most people don't know why every single year it gyrates like that. So this is the real fun part. It turns out that about 3/5 or so of the land mass, if not 2/3, on the Earth is in the Northern Hemisphere. So in the Northern Hemisphere, the line goes down, the CO2 gets lower, because in the spring, any minute now, the grass gets green, the tree leaves come out, and that's the inhalation of carbon from the Northern Hemisphere. In fact, the zigzag lines are the difference between the Northern Hemispheres and the Southern Hemispheres' yearly inhalation of carbon, right? So that's breathing right there. So isn't that crazy? So yes, the CO2 is going up, but yes, we have a huge amount of agency with what to do with the carbon that's out there, okay? So about 1/6 of the CO2 in the atmosphere is acted on, breathed in, taken in by plants. Some stays long-term in plants and soil, some don't. We'll get into that part, but it's just worth knowing that a huge amount of the carbon is in the living sphere, and we can have wonderful effects on it. Just think of the difference from mowing an acre to having 200 trees on an acre. So we're going to get into how our ecosystems and conscious humans, how have we built high carbon soil? So as we know, when soil looks good and black and crumbly like that, that darkness is carbon, generally speaking. So that's a high carbon soil. You can tell by looking at it, okay? And so if all farmlands look this good, we wouldn't have extra carbon in the atmosphere. It would be in the most productive possible place. So we'll look at how we do this. And one way we built soil, so look at this as a field trip to the prairies, maybe 200 years ago, and you have perennial plants. So perennial plants are long-lived plants, like all of them on the right 9/10 of the slide. And the perennial plants last for many years and come up from the rootstocks. But one thing that isn't known by everybody is that maybe half or 1/3 of those roots die every year. So when you have perennial systems, number one, you have more roots than annuals. So look carefully on the far left. That's to symbolize lawn or maybe an annual crop. When you have a short crop, you have short roots, generally speaking. And when you have annuals, you have much smaller roots. So your annuals won't be able to put a lot of carbon in the soil, mostly because they don't have half to 1/3 of these roots you're seeing that die every year, right? So we intact perennial-based diverse ecosystems add a lot of carbon by roots dying off every year. They add a lot of sponginess and soil carbon by dying on top, the detritus, they call it, the ground cover layer builds up. So those are two ways we're building soil carbon. And just look at the difference, okay? Behind his head on the right side of the slide are annual wheat. And look at the difference with perennial plants. So if half or 1/3 of those roots die every year, you have, they call it building the soil carbon sponge. You're gonna have places for rain to go as those roots die, and you build that sponginess. So again, we're having all these tremendous storms, yes, because there's more energy in the atmosphere from a lot of carbon and whatnot. But if our soils are compacted and low in carbon, a lot of that's going to run off. But we can build very spongy soils by employing more perennial crops and a lot of other techniques, okay? So just note the difference. So we're still talking about how we're building high carbon soils with different type of systems. So here's the concept I mentioned. So see the sun shines, right? Hits the leaves, we have photosynthesis, right? So that takes water from the tree and CO2 from the atmosphere. It combines it and builds it into sugars, which you might consider the lifeblood, the blood of the tree. So the tree has decisions to make, right? It can make more leaves, it can make more trunk, it can make more roots, or this fourth way, as you follow the yellow arrows going down, the plant could say, I need to invest in my buddies. So all the white things here are just an artist's rendition of mycorrhizal funguses. A lot of you will know this, but for those that don't, there's a whole group of funguses, right? So most people think of funguses as the mushrooms on logs. that break down dead matter, right? And that's a huge amount of fungus species. About 2/3 of the species are those saprophytic funguses that break down dead matter. But this group is called mycorrhizal because they live in close association with the plant's roots. So about 85 to 90% of plants have these mycorrhizal associations. So basically this tree in this illustration has huge advantages over a tree that doesn't have mycorrhizal associations, because what it does is it decides to feed these mycorrhizal funguses these sugars, and then the funguses give a huge advantage to the tree. They can go out and they can crack rocks. They can get more water out of soil and places than the plant's roots can by orders of magnitude. We've also recently learned that plants can now communicate with each other through the fungal network. So plants can more or less order nutrients that they need in communication with the mycorrhizal funguses. But what else is really cool is when the tree or any plant, so this is just a tree for illustration, a lot of plants are mycorrhizal, grasses and whatnot. When they decide to give these, they're called exudates, they exude, they sweat out the liquid through their roots. When they do that, they're investing in the future. But what that does is that puts those carbons in long chains, and that's how you make humus, which lasts longer than the dead roots, okay? So these dead roots are more labile carbon. So one carbon cycle, you might say, is short-term things like compost and dead roots that give energy but break down quickly. There's a whole other cycle of carbon that goes through plants and exudates and microbes and makes humus that's longer lasting, that has better structural effects. So this is the third major way that ecosystems can build high carbon soils. And again, this is ecosystems that aren't poisoned. So mycorrhizal funguses need times to set up relationships to do this. But if you're using herbicides, and a lot of herbicides or antibiotics, these relationships are greatly hindered. So this is one reason, like, why haven't I heard about this? Why don't I study this in soil science? Mostly times soil scientists study dead ecosystems and concentrate on physics and chemistry, what's there. And then the roots of trees or plants act like straws, and they just suck up what's that word? What's dissolved? There's a better word for it. Anyway, so we have several ways where we're making good soil that we're most of the way through here. So the different times the plant can decide what to do with that carbon, with that energy from photosynthesis. And at times they can give a great amount into the soil structure, feeding their symbionts. And there's also symbiotic bacteria too. So we're still in the prairies and we have our diverse ecosystems. So we're just illustrating how high carbon soils can be built. And along comes grazers, and if they hit the sweet spot of just enough grazing and a little bit of disturbance, leaving liquid and solid nutrients and a little bit of hoof action. So you don't want to overgraze. It's the Goldilocks principle. But if you graze a little bit and have a little bit of disturbance, the ecosystem bounces back quickly. It'll slough off more roots, and you're building happier perennial systems via the action of the grazers. Okay, so this is what they mean by regenerative ag or regenerative grazing. That's more and more common. So I always ask people, geez, are cows bad? The truth is, cows are neither good nor bad, like humans. It's how they're managed and how it's all going. So let's say we're still out on the prairies, and every 2, 3, 5 years you get a fire coming along. So the same question, are fires bad? Often they are. especially in areas that historically had a lot of fire, where they built a lot of tinder and a lot of extra fuel. If you have the fire that burns so hot, it burns everything down to ash and sterilizes the first few inches of soil, yes, then the fire can be bad or destructive. But if the fire goes through intermittently and doesn't burn everything to ash and leaves a lot of black dust, this is better known as charcoal. So this is another form of carbon we're getting to. So there's many different forms of carbon here that each have their cycle. So a lot of the prairie soils in the Midwest are so good and so comparatively healthy right now, in spite of the type of farming we've been doing to them. It turns out a lot of the monosoils, or the really good prairie soils, have up to 40 or more % of the carbon that's in them is pyrolytic, meaning comes from fire. So they can do the carbon testing and figure out that this black dust on the right, in several hundred years, it'll be darker soil, small dust. They can still test that and find out that this black carbon is still in there. So that's something else that they're starting to call biochar now. Okay, so charcoal that's in soils or charcoal that's made to go into soils is just now newly called biochar. And this is also in Jamaica, where in the tropics, the soils are not as good. And so when you can get good black soil, it's really just like gold. So briefly, we're talking about a more long-lasting recalcitrant form of carbon now. So we're just moving up the scale of recalcitrance or longer lasting. So these comparisons are real interesting. So on the left, a lot of archaeologists were digging in old Amazonian village sites and finding this black earth or terra preta. And it's like, this is crazy. The soil around here looks like it is on the right. What's up? And these are man-made soils, it turns out, and they're full of this black charcoal. And it's really, really valuable, holds moisture. And right now, if you want to buy farmland in Brazil, if you buy a farm that looks like the left-hand slide, it'll cost you 5 times as much as that one on the right. So think about leaving that kind of legacy. So these were villagers that made these soils on purpose. There's a lot of different theories about why and how they might have done it, and we don't have time for everything here. But nonetheless, this black charcoal lasts hundreds of generations or long times in the soil and provides a huge amount of benefits, which we'll try to whip through pretty quickly, because biochar is a whole other rabbit hole to go down. So they found out that these were man-made soils. They had pottery and fish bones and whatever in them. And I've kind of mentioned this already, that it's just a new term for charcoal in soils, okay? We don't have to think about it too much. We kind of know what charcoal does, right? So you can use it in many ways, and we use this too. So it's a great deodorizer. It's a really good feed supplement for farm animals. It's a good mix with any kind of fertility you want to have, seaweed, fish residues, rock dust, you name it. So we don't have to get too deep down this particular road. But here in Stockholm, Sweden, and I have a hyperlink to this in your handout, they collect all the sticks and all the yard waste and they chip them up. And in the winter, they fire up a big boiler that makes charcoal. And we'll get into the hows and whys of that a little bit. But then they mix that with compost and they have big, healthy root spaces for trees. They make humongous big pits. And their street trees are the envy of Europe. They have the best street trees because they've structured the soils. But biochar is a part of it with with compost and gravel. And picture the storm drains. When it rains, all the water flows into this humongous underground box, more or less, full of charcoal that helps filter it, hold water, and make really, really happy trees, because the charcoal not only holds water and nutrients, but provides aeration as it dries out. So it's kind of a great characteristic, great material for adding to soils. So we I shouldn't have showed. I thought I had cut this one out. This is just a schematic of those boxes with Swedish. That's for the advanced class. Just kidding. So in your handout, also I have an article called 55 Uses of Biochar. So one of them is, picture you have a wine cellar going back to the 1500s in Switzerland, and you want to have a natural plaster. So what they did is they substituted all the sand that's in natural plasters with charcoal. So you have mostly a plaster made of charcoal and clay that can regulate humidity just right, between 60 and 80%. It provides more insulation. It blocks EMF, or electromagnetic frequencies, so cell phone signal and whatnot. And it acts as a filter to filter out smoke and mold. So the wine cellar guys really love these natural plaster with charcoal. So there's all manner of other cool uses. Activated carbon is in every emergency room in the world. Animal feed in Europe, you're allowed to sell it to feed animals for some goofy reason. We're not in the US, but that's just an idea. There's markets out there. So this is a pause after the biochar rabbit hole, which we can save and talk to later. This is my wife, Carol, and I at Ferncliff, or Benton Hollow, as we called it back in 2015. So love those bluebells, and any old time they'll be back. So I misspoke. I'm going to talk briefly about how we make the charcoal, which is a great soil additive. So basically, the fire and flame burns this piece of wood into the black, into charcoal. If you keep it going or add it to a fire where it holds the heat, it'll burn that charcoal all the way to ash. So basically, when you make charcoal, you're just trying to do the first half of the fire. The first half is burning wood into charcoal and stopping it at that point. So there's other ways to look at it, right? The pyrolysis here in the middle of this is the flame. So coming in on the top left, you have, let's say, 100% of the carbon that's in that pile of wood chips, let's say, and they go in a reactor that basically burns. But if it only burns halfway, like we described, you go down to the bottom left, and about 50% of that original carbon will be in that long-term form of charcoal, right? And about another 50% of that carbon was burned off in the flame, and that can be used for going to top right now to biofuel for energy and whatnot. So this is the technical version of that. So basically, there's our old dog Hucky, who's no longer with us, but I have a small cook stove that makes the left-hand bucket into the right-hand bucket and burns clean. So we have a wood stove that gets some charcoal. We have cook stoves, and we make it in other ways, right? So you could have a fire that you light at the top, and as it burns down, if you look at all the pictures on here, when the fire's flame is mostly out, like you see on the bottom right, you put it out. Basically, you'll have some ash in there, but you have a lot of charcoal. So there's just different ways of managing the fire for half the burn, you might say. And we just don't have time to get into this too awful much. But if you look up Jack Daniel's charcoal, you'll see how they do it on a large scale, just like this. Nothing fancy, a top lit fire they put out at a certain point. Or you could make it in troughs. And what's up with troughs or pits is that the fire can only get air from the top. So in these things, you'll build up hot coals, build up hot coals, build up hot coals from the bottom up. And at a certain point, when you run out of fuel, you put it out. So again, this is just real fun stuff. Some of the neat things that the charcoal or biochar does is it absorbs things, and you can see the structure. So it holds the structure of the wood it was originally part of. So, but let's back up and say that this charcoal is another form of carbon. What it does is it performs these functions of holding on to nutrients and water and providing aeration and exchange sites for nutrients. for centuries, right? But this is backing up a little bit. This is just saying for every 1% of soil carbon, so that could be charcoal, or it could be humus, or it could be dead roots, or any combination. All soil tests have SOC, soil organic carbon, or OC in them. When you change that from 1 to 2%, look at all the extra water you hold per acre or per hectare, they're saying here. But this is why it's so critical to restore the sponginess, the carbon of soils, not just because of climate, but because of weather, because of storms, because we need to hold and absorb these big rains that are going to come. So it's fairly astounding. So to back up, this type of agriculture is great. It's what feeds us, but we should all just be aware that when the soil is bare or tilled or exposed, it's breathing out a lot of carbon. I think I have it next. No, I don't. Okay. So when we till it and when we make it bare, we aerate it, we give it oxygen, and then the micro critters, mostly bacteria, go to work, eat those dead roots, bits of organic matter. And then as they die, that's great nutrients for the next crop. Okay, that's great. But what else they do is they export a huge amount of that carbon, that sponginess, that dark soil gradually goes into the atmosphere. So this is also a hotter landscape. So if our farm fields are always covered with green roots, like on the left here, we're gonna A, build more carbon, B, hold more water, and C, be better citizens. And the middle one is a mulched one, and the one on the right obviously looks like that field. So the more agriculture can look like the left side all the time of the year, and we're seeing this, cover crops are really being adopted at a wide scale locally and regionally. Oh, I got it out of order. This one was supposed to be right after the bare field, pardon me. So this is the kind of things that happen when we till. And I'm not saying, oh, never till. I mean, we till too. It's just that we got to know tilling is a strong practice. Picture it like a hammer, right? You got to be careful using hammers. You can hurt yourself or you can build something, okay? So in the same way, tilling is a major disturbance that should be used real carefully, thoughtfully, and we just, as long as we can minimize the time when our soils are bare, we're exporting less nutrients to the atmosphere. And farmers know this intuitively. Now, this is interesting. These are called the Morrow plots. They've been using for experimental agriculture in Illinois or Indiana since 1876. And it's like 2.5 feet or more distant difference there. The guy on the left with the black, that farm field is flat as a cue ball. That soil is not running away. It doesn't run away. All that carbon on the left side part since 1876 is in the air, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tons per acre. So that's the strength of this, and how in the long term and even pretty short term, our practices are inadvertently building up carbon, having us lose carbon. And this guy, I didn't put his book here. This guy named Gabe, G-A-B-E, Gabe Brown. His book, Dirt to Soil, is really excellent talking about this. So he's up to 7 and even more % of soil organic matter, and his neighbors are about 1, and he's making money. He's buying the neighbors' ranches. So if you can switch to regenerative practices, you can really lower your input cost and make money as a farmer. And we'll get into other types of practices too. So this is our little beauty shot, pausing between the carbon part. So now we're going to really have fun. Hope we're still doing okay on time. I've lost all track of time. So let's pretend the sun shines, right? And if I was doing this in person, I'd ask, who's heard of the heat island effect, right? This was first discovered, I believe, in Atlanta, where the sun shines on the city and the city's way hotter than the countryside. So one reason it's hotter is the sun shines and it makes what's called sensible heat. Heat you can feel. The sidewalk gets hot, the building gets hot, the road, especially the black road, gets hot. And in big areas where that happens, like cities, picture it just a vortex of hot air going up in the air, right? And that's what happens. What that is called high pressure, right? So they discovered this when they realized that the areas surrounding Atlanta were mostly wooded. This was, a while back, and still mostly wooded. Thunderstorms would come roaring toward Atlanta, and they bounce off this column of heat, which repelled the low pressure of storms. Okay, so that's called the heat island effect. And we have a lot of that happening where, if you look on the left, let's say that bare field we saw, when the sun shines on it, it's hotter there, right? It's hotter there for several different reasons. One, there's no shade, but two, the sun hits a brown surface and it makes the brown surface, the soil, hotter, right? So if you look on the left half of the graph there, you'll see way more what's called sensible heat you can feel, less evapotranspiration. In other words, the soil will evaporate a bit, but not nearly as much as trees or plants will evaporate, right? So even bare soil and also urbanized areas and roads and whatnot are more like the left side of this. So if we can move our landscapes toward the right side, where when the sun shines, if it hits greenery that photosynthesizes, that is heat that turns into chemical energy, right? So that chemical energy makes those sugars we talked about, but also later on, as the trees breathe out, they breathe out water vapor. So that's a cooling effect. So the landscape on the right not only is cooler because it has green on the surface, but it gets cooler and stays cooler because of the cooling effect of transpiration. So that happens in small areas and in large areas, okay? So think of this in terms of the last slide, right? So that evapotranspiration is happening out in the farmlands and the rural parts, and luckily the little pockets where they might have a green roof in the city. But the more all our landscapes can look like the right-hand side, the better heat citizens will be. So kind of a similar discussion, drained and mowed meadows are high on the left-hand column. Natural bottomland meadow in green on the left is way cooler. So we know this, we can feel it. Again, this isn't rocket science. This is stuff we can feel. And we know what kind of landscapes are cooler. And we also know that in an aggregate, cooling begets cooling and warmth begets warmth in a way. So another way to look at it, and this is another way water is a huge driver. The water vapor has a big story to tell. So when the sun shines and it hits white clouds, and they have I don't know if it's higher or lower, the term is albedo, but basically the heat of the sun bounces away on those white clouds. So one reason we're cooler under a cloud is not as much sun energy reaches us, but that's also the cooling effect of a lot of vegetation. So a lot of the water in clouds, some comes from the oceans, of course, but a lot comes from trees, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So, right, so this is the hotter landscape that I mentioned, writ large. And this is a cooler landscape, okay? So this is so interesting how just recently, okay, this is coming out in 2018. The article was called Rivers in the Sky. I love this. So indicates that the continuing disruption of tropical, when I'll say any forest, is disrupting the movement of water, causing major shifts in precipitation, blah, blah, blah. But what's so interesting is this is a cool landscape. We can see it, we can feel it. But look at this. So above that landscape in the Amazon, there's more water in the atmosphere than there is in the mighty Amazon. So a huge amount of cooling action. And the other part is, this time of year, when it's cloudy, it's warmer. That's because the earth is heating up a little bit and the clouds can kind of trap that heat in near us. And it's colder at night when there's no clouds and there's no water vapor in the clouds to trap that heat. So the water works in several beneficial ways in the atmosphere. So note that each of these trees is giving a huge amount of cooling, huge amounts that we can feel. So this is not to say that the carbon piece isn't huge. It's obviously huge. I'm a major carbon guy, but it's just worth knowing that water is equally important, and we do better when we don't separate everything. So this is the carbon and water together presentation. So they call it functional vegetation. Look at it as a valve between the ground and the atmosphere. So the vegetation, the greenness when the sun shines, protects the ground from overheating, right? And drying out, and optimizes the amount of evaporation through the help of transpiration, the sweating of plants. So vegetation well stocked with water has a significant cooling and air conditioning capacity. So this is very interesting stuff. So I just wanted to, work through those big pictures before we're getting to the fun part. Number 3 is the different solutions we have. This is just a little beauty shot of the home landscape from 8 or 10 years ago when I was a big nursery guy. But what we can do is use agroforestry and silvopasture and different methods to both grow food, have diversity, be good to pollinators, be good to water and carbon at once. So opportunities abound. So this is a few slides from a presentation on a big hero of agroforestry. So this guy, John Hershey, lived in Downingtown and grew trees for farmers. So there's people doing this now for a living. They're getting more agroforestry and silvopasture and riparian buffers that are productive going in farmland. It's very exciting. And this guy was a pioneer who's been gone since the 60s. He was this is funny. Give me half a second. $6:45. Yikes. Okay, I'll try to wrap up kind of quickly. He was a Quaker who believed in peace, of all things. So this book on the right was highly recommended. Tree Crops is out there. So he has all these, he had nurseries and trees, and you can still visit the remnants of his trees in and around the Downingtown Friends meeting. So here's rows of persimmons that used to feed his pigs, chickens, and cows. So look at our farms as just shedding off this much productivity. When the ground looks like this, you've got happy pigs and chickens, farmers with extra income, animals grazing under cooler systems. So we had persimmons, mulberries of all kinds, honey locusts. So, a lot of different plants of all kinds. These honey locusts are very sweet, and they have light shade, and they have really good feed qualities. Crab apples of different kinds, a lot of nuts. So all this is a diverse, abundant landscape that was promoted and used, but we were kind of fed a different type of agriculture. So we'll try to get through this in time for some questions. So this is home. So at home, I don't have much lawn. So I have all my pawpaws growing with this understory. On the right front is the Amelanchier or Juneberry. These are a type of comfrey. So here's when I planted the pawpaws with a lot of these different native plants. And I quickly cover the soil and have different perennial crops around them. It looks way different now. Baptisia, Turkish rocket, a broccoli cousin. So also in the woods, the more layers of productivity you have, the more photosynthesis, the more spongy soil, the more diversity, the more productivity you're building. So these are ramp seeds we've been scattering since 2010. The ramps are the native onion family. There was 0 on the property when we came. And now we have tens of thousands just from scattering seeds. The bloom is not the ramps. The bloom is trout lily. But same with these. This is Sparky, our dangerous dog. And these are all from seed scattered since 2014. And that was taken last year. So the bluebells really respond quickly. We're happy. And I think this means we're largely through the talk. And that's another dog who's no longer with us in our backyard. Yeah. So I think I apologize for having to go so fast. I hope I was useful enough, but please avail yourselves of that handout. It has an email address for me. Get back to me. I'd love to ask to do questions and follow up of pretty much any time or any type. So how are we doing, Keith?
We're doing great, Dale. That was amazing. So it's incredible. And, a bunch of things struck me from that presentation. I've always, looked at those native perennials as the way that we need to go for habitat, and especially native pollinators, right? Those solitary bees, not the colonial ones and all that. But I never thought about the carbon effect on those root systems and increasing soil carbon. So can you comment a little bit more about that? And maybe even comment a little bit about, educating more people about that multiple effect, not just the pollinator habitat piece, but the soil seed piece.
Well, maybe I'm going to jot a note to send along with the handout another piece called the soil health principles that help with this. But basically, the more time of the year your soil is covered with green and growing roots, the more you're pumping liquid carbon in. So that's why it's good to have both trees and an understory. The more your soil is covered all the time and with either green growth or leaves, the better and healthier it is. But also the more the soil has those interactions with the mycorrhizal, the more diverse ecosystems go forward, left alone and unpoisoned, as it were, the more humus you'll build, because all that happens in a less disturbed system. Okay, so it's not that tilling is evil. It just got to understand what happens when you make the soil bare. And there's a huge amount of challenges to this. We got deer, we got invasive earthworms, on and on it goes. So, but it's important to understand the processes and the principles first. We can get to the details. I didn't mean to be dismissive. I hope that was a helpful answer.
No, definitely was. And actually, you brought up the invasive earthworms, and recognizing the effect that they have on humans. Do you have any more recent data than just the fear factor related to those organisms?
You guys had our buddy Doug Tallamy speak a while ago, and his latest book on oaks was really excellent. And I learn all kinds of things from the master every time I listen to him or read him. But oak leaves are harder, take another year or two longer to break down than others. So under oak leaves, you'll have a lot less. Okay, the invasive earthworms generally eat a lot of the leaves, but they'll eat the maple and other leaves quicker because they're softer.
Less lignin.
So more oaks is one piece, but no, I don't have specific techniques.
We did have some specific questions about biochar. So is it possible to put too much biochar into the soil and resulting in a negative impact? Or, how much is enough?
Oh, well, okay. The biochar has the most use when, let's say, you have land that was chemically or commercially managed and you're moving to organic. So you can use the absorptive capacity of char to hold on to some good compost teas or good nutrients that your soil wants. So ideally, you want to match your opportunity of holding nutrients and presenting them with the char with what your soils need, right? So, but often by as little as 5% by volume in potting soil, maybe 10%, you don't need a lot more than that to get a huge effect. So you just have to remember that raw biochar is something you don't often want to add to actively growing plants, because picture the raw biochar as hungry. It's like a sponge. It wants to suck up all the loose nutrients. So if you put raw, fresh biochar in with potting soil in an actively growing plant, it might make the plant run hungry for a while as the char competes with the roots for those nutrients. So you want to mix that char with compost or compost tea or wood vinegar. The other thing to know is fresh char is going to be slightly alkaline because it'll have some ash with it. That alkaline tendency can be washed out pretty quick with vinegar or wood vinegar or any acidic thing, but just note that's there in the beginning. So yeah, if there's enough interest, I'll give a whole thing on biochar.
Or maybe we'll bring it back for the next season for biochar. That'd be great. Hey, can you make some comments on carbon sequestration credits for maintaining forested land? Like, I just saw this ad that was really appealing. Like, you know, if you keep your land in forest, we'll pay you for those carbon credits. But then part of me is like, well, that's pollution, or that's, you know, a ticket to pollute. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Well, I completely agree with your assessment, right? That's playing a little bit of defense that is not really called for right now. We need the offense of paying people to take their lawn and put trees in it, or to take their forest, especially if it's along a little stream, and put lots of trees there. And those trees can also help your farm animals. It's not taking land out of production, right? So those old models don't really hold up. So, you know, a little squirrely on, I want the government to be a good carbon promoter, but just preserving forests we have is not nearly enough, in my opinion. We need to do a huge amount of reforestation, particularly in cities and suburbs, and change the default setting on what a beautiful landscape looks like. I mean, that's what we've been doing in the native plant space for 1,000 years, making more wild looking landscapes like the pictures of mine. They're a little wild for certain people, right? We're trying to change what's acceptable landscape, and yeah, it's a world of tricks, master.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that aesthetic, changing that aesthetic's a pretty steep climb, but definitely worth it. And I was so happy to see you show those root zones of the native perennials versus the non-natives. I mean, that's so dramatic. So not only, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier, the above ground beauty of those plants and above ground benefit in terms of biodiversity and habitat, but then you've got the whole below ground aspect of those organisms that are, you know, part of the climate solution. So it's like, why wouldn't you put that on your land instead of a non-native lawn mix? We have a couple of, oh, good.
We're just used to defining agriculture as annuals of one kind. Right. And we have to redefine agriculture, just little things.
Yeah. So we got an interesting question about no-till gardening, right? We talk about no-till ag all the time, but maybe not so much about no-till gardening. And could you comment on that, and maybe a little bit more about the mycorrhiza that we might find in a no-till garden system?
Sure. Yeah, briefly, no-till ag is generally made possible by using lots of chemicals, and a lot of those chemicals are busy killing off the microbiology. So hopefully we're talking about organic no-till here as a bare minimum entry point. And I would just say that you want to avoid compacting the soil, right? So too much walking on, making beds. And sure, we got to get rid of weeds and whatnot. So you're generally talking about keeping it covered with a mulch, keeping walking away from it, rotating crops, because and this is important. Remember, let's harken back to that prairie slide with the deep roots. You were saying that in intact ecosystems, plants are givers and takers. Oh, one fixes nitrogen. Oh, the other leaves a lot of leaf litter. Oh, the other has the deeper roots that help percolate the water later on. So in an annual or in a monoculture system, plants have needs. We have to meet those needs. But in created ecosystems, like we've shown some of, everybody contributes. And that's how live communities work. So that's another one of the things we have to disabuse ourselves of, is that the plants are individuals. Ideally, we're building robust, diverse systems. And, we got to do that in different ways. So it probably wasn't the most direct answer to the no-till garden, but I'm going to write down soil health principles, and we'll get them to the gang at least.
But I think that's a key point of this, though, right? That one of the early slides that you had, it said that it's intact, alive ecosystems and conscious human health. And I think a lot of times we view ourselves as separate from the natural world and not intervening in any of that. And yet, if we intervene in the right way, in a positive, conscious way, thinking about the consequences of that intervention, it can have a huge positive impact. And as a species, we've been doing this for eons. As the soil picture that you showed from the Amazon basin, I mean, how many thousands, or how old is that soil that was created by humans, eons ago? And so we've been part of this system. And if we maintain that positive role, we can really overcome some of these huge challenges that we face.
Yeah. We can be restorative. We could be regenerative. So I always shrink back a little bit when they say, "Oh, we need less humans." We need better humans. I would say we have too many. I'm not saying we need more. Certainly not. But I don't think the question is numbers. It's a question of how we live. And us guys in the permaculture space say we just have to reinvent a culture of whatever I said in that quote, culture of renewability, a different type of culture. We have an extractive culture, generally speaking, now. Right. And that's gotten us to where we're at. So it's the old Chinese proverb, unless we change direction, we're going to end up where we're heading.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Dale, thanks a lot. This was really amazing. And I think we're just scratching the surface on this. So I think we'll definitely, love to have you back again in the future. One of the big takeaways for me is one of the reasons why I'm involved with the Conservancy is because we are facing so many huge global problems. And I really look at land protection as one key way of addressing some of those big picture problems. And that land protection is climate resilience. And you really drove that point home for me today with all of this regenerative work that you are so expert at and just so knowledgeable in, that this is climate resilience. And this is what I can leave for my kids and my grandkids. This could be my legacy if I implement some of these relatively not easy, but simple principles on the land that I'm here to store. I can really have a net positive effect on the future generations to come. And so, thanks so much for turning us on to that. And folks, Dale's handout that he's referencing here and some of those other references will be available when we send out the link to the recorded presentation. You'll get that in about a week. So keep an eye on your email inboxes for that. Remember, we've got a bunch of other upcoming both in-person and virtual events this spring. It's a real busy spring for the Conservancy, so come on out and join us again. Dale, thank you so much. Really, really phenomenal. Good night, everybody.
I'm here to serve. Good night.